Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this pre-budget event. I'm Paul Johnson. I'm Director of the IFS, and I'm very pleased to say that whilst we were expecting a budget back in the autumn, we finally got one for the second year in a row, not when we were intended to have one, but in the spring. And we, the IFS, are having done our big green budget back in the autumn, coming to revisit some of those issues and going to provide a look ahead to the budget, which will be on the 3rd of March. Today, you're going to hear from 4 people. First of all, Ben Navarro from Citi will be talking about the economic outlook. I think his message will largely be there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and you'll see that in the scale of the difference between some of his scenarios going forward. And that, of course, matters enormously to the kinds of decisions the Chancellor will and perhaps won't be taking in a couple of weeks' time. Then my colleague Isabel Stockton will talk about the public finances, and of course the economic uncertainty means there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction of the public finances, but certainly on a central scenario, whilst this isn't something to worry about quite yet, we're clearly going to be moving into a world in which we're neither heading towards anything approaching the current budget balance that the Chancellor has suggested that he wants, or indeed a world in which debt is stabilised. After that, you'll hear from my colleague Jonathan Cribb, who will talk about some of the measures that have been put in place to protect jobs and the economy through the crisis and how they might be continued or phased out over the next several months. And then finally, Helen Miller will talk about some of the issues associated with supporting the economy through a recovery phase when we move back to something somewhat more normal. You should all have access to the Slido app. If you have questions, please put them in the app. We should have plenty of time at the end of the talks to respond to questions. Put the questions in there. Vote for those you think are the ones you're most keen on hearing answers to. I'm going to stop now. You won't hear from me again until all 4 of the speakers have finished. They'll run one after the other. And as I say, do put questions into the Slido app as and when they occur to you. I will disappear now and hand over to Ben.
Hello, good morning all, and thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure this morning once again to be partnering and speaking here with the IFS. Now, in my comments this morning, I'm afraid I'm probably going to strike a slightly more cautious tone than particularly some of the reporting we've seen in recent days. And what I want to do specifically, as Paul mentioned, was really drill into a little bit more of the detail around the potential uncertainties and indeed the challenges that may still lie ahead for the UK economy as we plot a path out of the pandemic. Now, to kick off, I think 3 points are particularly notable. The first is, even with the welcome and successful disbursement of a vaccine, the scale and persistence of COVID's economic impact remain deeply uncertain, and some effects should be expected to persist. Second, the UK labour market is still likely to face a challenging 2021 as crisis-era support is wound down. And third, it's likely that greater support for firm and household solvency, as well as liquidity, is likely to be necessary if a more complete near-term recovery is to be secured. Now, consensus expectations for the UK are, as you might expect, for a pretty sharp contraction in the first quarter of this year, followed by a very marked recovery, or rather rebound, in the quarters thereafter. Now, the key drivers here are clearly to do with the pandemic, restrictions imposed on the 4th of January appear to be weighing a shade more severely on output than those we saw in November. However, output is still likely to be materially more resilient in Q1 compared to Q2 of 2020, when we had the first round of lockdowns, and that's primarily to do with business adjustment in the interim. Now, as I said, broad expectations are for a very marked rebound through Q2 and Q3, and there we don't disagree. But the key issue really for the UK this year is likely not to be the speed of the recovery through the second quarter as restrictions are eased, but rather the completeness of it, and specifically whether we start to return to a level of output similar to what we saw before the pandemic relatively quickly. Now, on that score, we think there are relatively good reasons to be somewhat cautious. We expect the vaccines to offer an end to the lockdowns, but not necessarily an end to the economic consequences of the pandemic. And in particular, we think the vaccine should, for example, reduce some of the risks to NHS capacity and therefore allow a more widespread easing of some of the more restrictive non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as national lockdown. But it does seem that some some less invasive forms of social distancing are likely to remain necessary, and that was implied by the SAGE modelling at the start of January. But I think more important is, given it seems that the vaccines are not likely to be enough alone to keep case numbers low, we also expect some precautionary behaviour is likely to persist through the second half of the year. Now, for individuals, it seems that many still don't expect to return to the same pattern or level of spending that we saw before the pandemic, and that was implied in Bank of England's survey data published in the Monetary Policy Report in February. But also, with the virus continuing to circulate and with the potential threat of mutations, we think some uncertainty for firms is also likely to persist. Behavioural early evidence from Israel and the United States seems to suggest that those who have been vaccinated still exhibit some precautionary behaviours, even as case numbers remain relatively high. And also, some of the evidence from Australia suggests that social consumption can still remain lower, even when case numbers have fallen materially as well. So combined, it is possible that we enjoy a fuller and more complete recovery in household consumption, and clearly that's what we would all hope for. But we think all of this continues to suggest some caution could persist. And indeed, we expect that to contribute to a more lingering gap to pre-COVID levels of output through the latter half of this year. So indeed, in our central scenario, we expect output in the fourth quarter of 2021 to be around 3% below where it was at the end of 2019. And for sake of comparison, during the financial crisis, the peak to trough fall in GDP was around 6%. So this would still constitute a very marked gap in UK output compared to pre-coronavirus levels. Now, one important point here is that the structural exposure or greater exposure of the UK economy to some of these lingering effects is likely to persist. In particular, we know that the UK has a greater share of private consumption in its composition of GDP. It also has a greater reliance on business exports and also a more urbanized economic geography compared to many comparable economies. The implication of the faster vaccine rollout, therefore, may be an earlier rebound compared to many other economies in the G7, but potentially one that proves less complete compared to others that, say, are more weighted towards manufacturing. Now, clearly, one important question here, especially for the second half of the year, is how much support the UK economy may enjoy, particularly from a large accumulation of household saving during the pandemic. And here we think there are also good reasons to be somewhat cautious. The key here when thinking about the potential boost is to understand why and among whom these savings have been accumulated. And in the UK, these seem to have been concentrated among higher income households who in particular have foregone social consumption. Now, there are three ways of thinking about the potential boost that might subsequently come from the unwind of these accumulated savings. The first is an idea of deferred demand, so households have saved in order to spend later. Now that we think is likely to be somewhat muted in this case because it's very difficult to substitute consumption on services across time, much more so say than in the case of durable goods, and we know that from evidence of previous VAT cuts. The second way of thinking about this is in terms of accumulated cash balances of households. So it doesn't really matter why households have accumulated the cash that they have. All that matters is that they now have it and they're likely to spend it. Now, indeed, this could provide some support, but historically, richer households in particular have tended to put more of these sorts of kind of lumps of cash into assets rather than into actual consumption. We saw that, for example, with the housing market de-equitization of the early 2000s. So as a result, we think more of this money is flowing into assets and in particular into housing assets rather than it being sort of stored up for actual consumption. Now, we should expect stronger household balance sheets to provide some boost to consumption, but those are likely to be quite diffuse and quite protracted. And at least in the near term, they may be partially offset by some increases in savings among lower income households that have been hit hard already through the pandemic and have dissaved on average, and are also likely now to be more exposed to some of the labour market consequences of the pandemic. Now, in addition to coronavirus, the UK economy is also working through quite a profound shock, we think, associated with the rapid transition to the relatively rudimentary UK-EU trade deal agreed at the end of 2020. In the near term, it's pretty difficult to disentangle the impact of COVID-related disruption and Brexit-related disruption. I think that's a pretty academic question. I think more important is merely to note that both seem to be disrupting trade very heavily at the start of this year. But we do see in some of the early survey data that Brexit is beginning to weigh pretty heavily on UK exports. For example, the latest ONS business impact of coronavirus survey showed 26% of trading firms experiencing disruption owing to additional customs duties or levies. And one important point here is, with the UK having enjoyed the benefits of weak sterling without any of the actual economic frictions associated with Brexit, those dynamics are clearly now going into reverse, and we expect the subsequent adjustment to weigh quite heavily on the UK through this year and the next. Now, both COVID and to a lesser degree Brexit, we think will continue to imply a marked hit to the UK labour market over the coming months. We saw, one of the features of our forecasts compared to, say, those produced by the Bank of England is a more profound loss of economic momentum in the second half of this year compared to that in theirs. And that in particular is to do with the kind of what we expect to see in terms of a higher level of unemployment, the associated impact on household sentiment, and the subsequent tendency of higher unemployment to propagate itself a bit as it subsequently has a negative impact on demand and on GDP. Now, we saw a record acceleration in redundancies in the latter part of 2020 as the government planned to wind down support even as demand remained subdued. And we expect the same dynamics to materialize again in the second half of this year, with still evidence of widespread vulnerabilities, especially in sectors such as hospitality and in retail. Now, we think the recovery in the labour market will invariably lag if unemployment does increase. That's in part to do with what I described previously, this tendency of weak unemployment to propagate itself, but also potentially matching issues within the UK labour market. And in particular, the idea that the recovery in vacancies and job growth may be driven by sectors that aren't really looking for the sorts of workers made redundant by parts of the consumer services sector, and that could weigh on a more persistent basis. Now, one important additional point here that could weigh on the recovery in the labour market is if firms are sort of lumbered with elevated levels of debt through the latter part of the pandemic. Now, that could weigh on job creation, but it could also weigh on business investment. Now, all I really want to say here is to emphasize the chart on the right-hand side, which shows labour productivity growth over the last 150 years or so. And what you can see is the decade since the financial crisis has been the weakest on record. Now, broadly, we all already know this, but with immigration now likely to be materially lower in the UK government's new points-based immigration regime, it seems likely that this is going to come to the fore of many policy discussions over the coming years, and highlights that business investment now must be an absolute priority. A final quick point on inflation. We expect inflation to be relatively resilient this year. In part, that reflects some disruption associated with some associated border disruption and some of the issues I described previously with respect to Brexit, which does seem to be adding to some exceptional goods inflation at the start of this year. But more generally, the key here are transitory issues such as base effects in energy and also some base effects associated with imputation. And we expect above target CPI to gradually ease through the latter part of this year and into 2022. Now, for the Bank of England and for monetary policy, we think if our expectations broadly pan out as we've suggested, this will likely push the Bank of England to try and do more, we think. To date, we've seen policy in the UK primarily being driven by fiscal policy, clearly, which has taken the burden. But we think increasingly, if the Bank of England's current optimistic forecasts are disappointed, this may force the Bank of England still to try and resort to trying to do more alone. And in particular, we continue to see the possibility of negative rates in the UK, potentially as early as in the latter part of this year. Now, just to wrap up and going back really to Paul's initial point right at the start of this presentation, I think the key thing to bear in mind is the UK economic outlook remains deeply uncertain. And you can see that on this chart by the sheer width of the fan chart. Now, what we've produced in collaboration with the with IFS is 3 scenarios, as we did in 2020. We've got our central scenario, whose core assumptions I've just set out for you here. But there's also the possibility, as many expect, that private consumption could prove more resilient and the labour market more robust. And that's the much stronger scenario you can see, the higher red line. And on the downside, there's also the possibility that vaccinations may not do enough even to obviate the need for further lockdowns, especially as we move into the winter of 2021 and 22. And that is reflected in the lower red line you can see there. The implication of both is that uncertainty remains incredibly high, and policy will have to remain highly vigilant to potential developments over the coming months, not just with respect to potential COVID mutations, but indeed the economic recovery as well. I'll leave it there and pass to Isabel at the IFS.
Thanks very much, Ben. Now, as my previous speakers have mentioned, and it probably won't surprise any of you, this extraordinarily uncertain outlook for the economy is also reflected in a similarly uncertain outlook for the public finances. I'm going to set out what that outlook looks like over the medium and the longer term, and some of the choices that will be facing the Chancellor at this budget. So let's start with borrowing. Now, we already know that borrowing this year is going to be record-breaking and is likely to reach something like £400 billion, almost 20% of national income. And we also know that it is likely to fall down quite substantially next year. But it's after next year when the 3 scenarios really start to diverge quite substantially and this uncertainty starts to become apparent. So in our central scenario, by the end of the forecast period in 2024-25, borrowing is still at around £125 billion around 2.5 times what it was before the crisis, but the range between the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios is really quite extraordinary. And this record high borrowing this year would be the highest outside the 2 world wars in the UK. But the really important part is not so much the spike this year, but that at the end of the medium-term forecast period, borrowing would still be quite substantially elevated above the long-run post-war average. Now, all this extra borrowing is, of course, going to be reflected in the debt burden. Casting our minds back, let's remember that even before the virus, the debt burden, when we strip out the temporary effects of Bank of England programs, was already forecast to remain flat over this period rather than fall decisively. Now, in our central scenario, instead of this flat path, we get a sharp increase this year, but then the debt burden continues to increase, albeit at a gentler pace. And once again, there's a large range of uncertainty with an even sharper, more persistent increase in the pessimistic scenario and a stabilization and very gentle fall in the optimistic scenario. Now, this would bring debt at the end of this medium-term forecast period to its highest level since about the late 1950s. But it's worth reminding ourselves that over the larger swathe of history, it was not so unusual to have the debt burden at this high level or even higher. And we should also keep in mind that this high debt burden coincides with an unusually low burden of servicing that debt. So if we consider the proportion of all government revenue that's taken up by debt interest costs, then that proportion is at its lowest level in all those 300 years of data that we have, and remains at such a record low level over the course of our central scenario. We should keep in mind, however, that these low interest rates are not necessarily locked in, and a lot of the additional borrowing that we're doing over the crisis is effectively being done at low or zero maturity. Now, where does this leave policy? Well, let's consider the situation we'll find ourselves in at the end of that medium-term forecast in 2025. I've already shown you that in our central scenario, debt will still be rising at that point, albeit not as steeply as it did over the past year. Now, what happens after that depends in part on policy. If we assume that all the structural borrowing we're doing at that point is going to persist indefinitely into the future, then that would put debt on an ever-increasing path. However, that is not even really the bad news, since this is predicated on borrowing costs remaining at their current ultra-low level. If instead borrowing costs return to their pre-virus level, which, keep in mind, was already a historically low level, and crucially, this was not accompanied by stronger growth and consequently higher revenues, then the debt burden would be on an even more steeply increasing path. Now, it seems unlikely that any government would be happy to just continue on this trajectory. So it seems more plausible that in this scenario, we would see some tax rises or some consolidation to at least stabilize debt. So if that were our target, to just get debt on a stable path, which as fiscal consolidation targets go is not particularly stringent, this would require a tax rise of 27 billion in that lower path where borrowing costs remain low, but 57 billion in that higher path, which is another illustration of the huge degree of uncertainty that we will be facing. Now, what does all this mean for the Chancellor's choices? Thinking back to the November spending review, at the time, the Chancellor substantially topped up spending plans to deal with the crisis for this year and next. But despite finding some extra money for defense, his overall spending plans were actually cut at that event for the following 3 years. And that cut may look small in this chart, but that's really just a function of the extraordinary scale of emergency spending this year. £12 billion is actually not that small of a cut. Now, it really seems difficult to imagine that we are going to come out of this crisis and we're going to end up spending less than we thought we would going into it. Indeed, there are lots of reasons to believe that we may instead be facing new spending pressures and end up spending more rather than less. To start with, children have lost around half a year of schooling. And if nothing were done to address this, and the consequences for future wages and productivity were just allowed to play out, that lots of other undesirable consequences would really hit revenues and therefore the public finances. Now, it's incredibly uncertain how much money will be required to remedy this loss, but the normal cost of providing half a year of schooling of more than £30 billion is probably a good benchmark to start from. So this could end up being a substantial spending pressure. There's also going to be lots of new and additional demands on the NHS, as the population is likely to be in poorer health as we come out of this, especially poorer mental health. There's a huge backlog of planned care in the NHS that will need to be addressed. And the government may also wish to spend more to make sure the NHS is prepared for any future pandemic or large emergency that may crop up. For example, spending more on PPE, on keeping track and trace systems, or which might be the most expensive of this list, having more spare capacity in the NHS in normal times. We may also believe that the experience of the past year may lead to growing public demand for other spending, such as to keep the £20 per week uplift to universal credit, or to address the funding gap that we expect to arise in local government services because the cost of providing those services is increasing. And we may also believe that this will give additional force to calls for better public funding for social care. So for all these reasons, we may find ourselves facing additional spending pressures. But what does that mean for fiscal policy? So the Chancellor has said that he wants to balance the books. One definition of balancing the books would be to get the current budget deficit down to zero. That would mean that we borrow to invest, but we don't borrow to fund our day-to-day spending. All our day-to-day spending would be covered by current revenues. If we consider our central scenario, then we already start out with a current budget deficit of £46 billion. If then these cuts that were penciled in November turned out not to be deliverable, that would be an extra 12 billion, making the uplift to universal credit permanent would cost around 6.5 billion a year in the long run, and closing the gap for local government cost pressures would come in at just over £2 billion. Now, there's an uncertain amount that would need to be spent to tackle backlogs and address additional demand for public services caused by the pandemic. In part, there'll also be a choice to what extent the government chooses to meet this extra demand. And in addition to uncertainty over these spending pressures, again, there's huge uncertainty over the economic outlook. And so if we find ourselves in either the optimistic or the pessimistic scenario, that could move the dial on the current budget balance by more than £50 billion each way. So what does this mean for the budget itself? Well, in the short run, borrowing is ultra cheap, and the Chancellor should not be overly worried about the public finances at this particular budget. Indeed, spending that would make the recovery more complete is likely to pay off, including, for example, spending to remedy the loss of half a year of schooling for children. In the medium run, it seems likely to us that there'll be a lasting increase in spending, and debt will be elevated for decades, with much of the extra borrowing during the crisis financed at zero maturities. This leaves the public finances more exposed to interest rate risks. Also, let's remember that long-standing issues such as the aging of the population haven't just gone away. The OBR estimates that the increase in annual spending on pensions, on health, and on social care associated with that aging would be around 39 billion per decade. All of this to say that net tax rises are now even more likely than perhaps they were before. And there's huge uncertainty over the necessary scale. But if we wanted to balance the books, then a £60 billion overall bill would not be implausible. And any permanent giveaways, for example, to address growing demand after the pandemic, would add further to this bill. So the Chancellor should really only commit to those permanent giveaways if he is sure that in future there will be an appetite for tax rises to pay for them. I will now hand over to Jonathan Krill, who will tell you a little bit more about the government's emergency programs during the pandemic and what their future might be.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Isabel for that. I'm going to tell you about the support schemes that the government has had for households over the last year and what potential is for their future. So back in March last year, the government announced about £12 billion of extra spending related to the pandemic. And at each time there's been a government announcement, the amount has grown up to about £280 billion cumulatively at the last announcement in November. Now, my talk is going to focus on only a fraction of this, that support aimed at households. That's the purple and blue bars here, which make up about 30% of the total coronavirus policy response. And the main household support schemes that the government has introduced are listed here. The first two really supporting employment, and the second two more supporting the incomes of low-income families. And all of these schemes, which I'm sure you've already heard about before, are due to currently end between the end of March and the end of April. And so in this presentation, I'm going to talk about these schemes and what the prospects for their continuation and their cessation are. So a bit of context first here is this slide here, which takes information from the Labour Force survey and looks at the proportion of working age people who are doing paid work in the week that they're interviewed. Now, one key thing to say here is that therefore, if you are fully furloughed, then you are not doing paid work under this measure. And you can see that going back to the Great Recession, that you see that dip in employment as shown most clearly on the blue rolling average line, the strong recovery in employment, and then the impact of the pandemic with the huge fall in the second quarter of last year, the rebound from that, but you can see that the proportion of people doing work is much lower even at the end of 2020 than it was pre-pandemic. And this is really motivating the current continuing existence of the employment support schemes. Now, the effect of this labour market disruption has not been equally distributed across the population. This shows the change in the proportion of people undertaking paid work between the end of 2019 and the end of 2020. And it's very clear here that there have been the falls have been massively concentrated in the youngest adults and in those people who are less formally educated. Really quite sharp contractions for them compared to the rest of the population. Now, to address all this, the government created the furlough scheme, which was initially planned to last only 3 months, but there have been successive extensions up until now, the end of April. This is a big, high-cost scheme. The OBR thought in November it would cost about £66 billion over the course of this financial year. That will be higher now because we didn't expect a third lockdown. And at the end of December, we had 3.8 million people who were still furloughed, an average cost of about £1,250 per person furloughed. Now, that 3.8 million is massively down on where it was in the spring last year, when it almost reached 9 million people. But you know, there's a bit of uncertainty about whether this is potentially, as I say, gone up again in January. Now, what should we do about the furlough scheme? Well, the fact that we still have economic restrictions on economic activity now and going forward into the future, which haven't yet been reduced, provides a strong case for the fact that the furlough scheme should be extended. But it should not be here forever. It does need to be tapered away. Now, it will partially naturally wind down as the demand for labour rises and firms unfurlough many of their workers. But it does actively need to be removed over the course of the rest of the year to allow the economy to adjust and recover, and for people to find for some people to find new and more productive roles for them for their employment. That being said, the furlough scheme is a pretty blunt instrument, and it occurs across the whole of the economy. If we end up with a situation in which restrictions on particular forms of economic activity persist, then the government should definitely consider a much more targeted scheme that lasts longer to target those affected industries. And I think a key one, an obvious one, might be airlines, but there might be others too. Now, alongside the furlough scheme, the government created the self-employment support income support scheme. This is pretty costly. It costs about £28 billion over the year, with just over 2.5 million self-employed people receiving those payments. And for people who do receive it, it has been extremely generous, because you get up to 80% of your pre-crisis profits, irrespective of how much you've lost. Given that generosity, a lot of the potentially eligible, over 3/4, seem to have taken it up. But the big thing to remember about the SICE scheme is that millions of people are excluded, self-employed people are excluded, they're not able to take it up. Now, alongside the furlough scheme being extended, we think that self-employed support in some form should be extended beyond the end of April, but then alongside the withdrawal of the furlough scheme, this scheme should also be withdrawn. And the other change the Chancellor really probably should make include some of those who have not been eligible for the original scheme. An obvious group are the 200,000 newly self-employed who were not able to be part of the original scheme as they hadn't submitted a tax return. They will now have submitted a tax return, and then therefore they can be included. And the government should also include at least some of the 1.5 million self-employed people who have been excluded because either their profits are above £50,000 per year or they have less than 50% of income from self-employment. At the moment, the scheme has very, very hard cliff edges in which people earning just a few pounds difference can either get really considerable payments from this scheme or nothing at all. And really that's not a good system. So the Chancellor should take this opportunity to smooth these cliff edges out and provide some support to some of these groups. The employment support schemes are not the only thing the government has done. The government has significantly increased benefits in the form of universal credit, and that's had really big impacts on the incomes of people, of families that are out of work. Now, to show this takes a single person with no children and looks at how much income the benefit system provides them over the last 40 years or so, if they're not in work. And the little triangle at the right shows what the effect of including the universal credit uplift and the temporary benefit measures have been a really big increase historically for this group. Now I'm just going to put this on a different scale because if you have children, you are generally eligible to a lot more out of work benefits. And you can see here the triangle on the purple line shows the levels of out of work benefit incomes with the UC uplift, and it basically that has reversed almost all of the reductions in benefits seen over the last decade. So these temporary uplifts in UC have been significant. What's the future for them? Well, if you let this uplift expire at the end of March, between March and April, it would lead to a fall in income of £80 for 6 million low-income families, and the kind of most affected group would be low-income single childless adults, for whom that would make up to 20% fall in their income. Now, giving people so little notice of really considerable falls in their income is frankly not a good idea. Although extending UC does cost £6.5 billion per year, it should be extended in some form beyond March, partly because of the lack of notice that cancelling, that allowing the uplift would mean for people, and partly because there's still a justification with the restrictions on economic activity to support people's incomes. Now, whether the uplift stays in the long run is really a choice about the appropriate level of benefits for different groups, but if they do get rid of it, it needs to be given a clear timetable and lots of communication to recipients. Last thing I have to say is about the minimum income floor in universal credit. For those who don't know what this is, the minimum income floor limits benefit support to self-employed people by assuming their earnings are at least equal to what they would earn if they were working full-time on the minimum wage. This is currently suspended until the end of April. Alongside all the rest of these things, the suspension should be extended beyond April, but it should be gradually, or something like the minimum income floor should be gradually introduced over time, because it does serve an important role in the benefit system for these two reasons shown on the screen. So to wrap up from me, it's important that the government continues to provide support to households in the labour market beyond April, given the restrictions on economic activity, but then these schemes do need to be gradually removed in order to allow the economy to adjust and indeed recover However, there is a case for providing more targeted support to those particularly affected industries over the next year or so. Some welfare support should be extended beyond April, in particular the minimum income floor. However, the minimum income floor needs to be gradually reintroduced over time. That's all I'm going to say, and I'm going to hand over for the last part to Helen.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, and hello everyone. So in this presentation, I really want to move beyond the types of support measures that Jonathan's been laying out to think about what happens in the recovery, and in particular to think at a very high level about once the lockdown measures have been eased and ultimately removed, what are the big policy challenges that are going to be left, and what are the very broad policy options that the government should be thinking about and looking to start announcing or implementing in the budget. So on the policy challenges, one big source of challenge is simply going to be that the crisis is going to leave us with some long run damage. Now, you've already heard about that, some in the other presentations, and there are various sources of it. Let me just give you a sense of where some of it's going to come from. So we've seen some large scale job losses. However you measure it, lots of people have lost their jobs. And of course, as the economy starts to recover, jobs will return, but that will take some time. And we know there can be some long run effects of periods of unemployment. So some long run effects there. On the business front, actually, it's been some pretty good news story so far. We haven't seen a mass exit of businesses. Largely, that's testament to the support measures that the government's been operating. But perhaps more worryingly, a recent ONS survey showed that 15% of businesses have no or low confidence that they'll survive the next 3 months. So there's still a risk there that if we see lots of viable businesses failing, there'll be some longer run consequences there. So there's a risk sitting there. And of course, it isn't just in the economy. There are these types of long run effects happening in various places. For example, Isabel highlighted that lots of children have lost lots of education, and that could have some long run effects. And across all of these dimensions, very many others, there's also been a really pretty big increase in inequalities. So again, just to show you one example of that, this chart shows you so the map shows you that the share of jobs furloughed has varied a lot across the country. And the bar chart shows you that the number of jobs lost has varied a lot, with London really standing out as having lost a lot of jobs. This has been a geographically unequal crisis, but it's also been unequal in terms of hitting people of different ages differently, those with different assets or education levels or health statuses. So as well as some of the longer run effects just purely through the economy, there'll be these longer run inequalities that will raise a policy challenge. So even if we could turn off COVID tomorrow, the economy wouldn't bounce back to its 2019 level. And of course, we shouldn't be thinking about going backwards at all. We should actually expect the economy to move to a new normal. COVID itself has likely changed how people want to work and shop and travel, so they don't want to go back to the old normal. Brexit has happened, and that will change in parts of our economy. And the government has some really pretty ambitious policy goals, including levelling up and net zero. So we should really be thinking about the economy facing these challenges and moving towards a new normal. And in the context of all those challenges, in the recovery phase, there's a clear role for a set of policies that do a combination of, initially help the economy to operate at capacity, to increase productive capacity and start undoing some of the damage that the crisis has caused, to steer and shape that new normal and to ease any adjustments towards it, and along the way to reduce various inequalities. So there is no small policy task ahead, even once the health crisis is over. So thinking about particular policy measures, the government actually already announced a set of recovery style policies last year. I've just put a list here as a reminder. Many of these were aimed at stimulating spending and starting the recovery. Obviously, that looks a bit premature at this point, but thinking, looking forward, there will potentially be a role for sort of a well-targeted temporary stimulus at some point. But at the moment, really supply and demand is being heavily constrained by the lockdown measures themselves. So there's very little room to be expanding output while those lockdown measures are in place. There's also uncertainty about how quickly they're going to be unwound. So I think at the moment, I wouldn't be expecting a targeted fiscal stimulus to be a big part of the budget, but the government should stand ready to act. And if the time comes, should be ready to have those kinds of targeted measures. Thinking more broadly about the policy levers the government has, there are clearly lots of things they could do. So one broad type of sort of category of thing they can do is just spend on investment and employment. And in the shorter run, one reason they might want to do that is to help absorb resources. So if you think there are going to be unemployed people and there are productive things you can get them doing, that can have a range of benefits. As one example of that, if the people with the right skills can be found, there is, as Isabel set out, a very large NHS backlog. People could be deployed to help clear that backlog. The key there will be whether we have the capacity to deliver that kind of program. But if we do, there could be benefits. Of course, there's also a whole range of spending you can do explicitly aimed to having longer run benefits. The common example that comes to mind there is always infrastructure spending, like roads, but also digital infrastructure. But it's really worth remembering that we should be thinking about a much broader range of capital. So not just physical capital, but also human capital, so thinking about training and skills that we'll need for the future, and environmental capital. And there's also spending on science and technology, which is important, especially in the context of longer run productivity growth. And actually in both of these areas, in investment and science, we've seen big increases in spending already. So this chart shows you government investment as a share of national income. You can see that it's already above its long run average, and it's due to stay above its long run average. And that's not just the effect of COVID, it's part of a broader programme of increased investment that the government's announced. Similarly, if we looked at science spending, you can see that science spending has been increased quite a lot. And similarly, it's not just about COVID, it's part of a broader policy action in that space, and part of there's new initiatives associated with that, of what the government wants to be spending on. Now, in both cases, that spending's been linked to the levelling up agenda. So this is kind of good news. There's more resource. They're thinking about the broad policy challenges. But of course, the devil's going to be in the detail. And the key will really be to spend this money well, to make sure, for example, that on the science spending, the government isn't just doing things that the private sector would do, but it's really doing things that wouldn't otherwise happen. And ideally, that's crowding in private sector investment. So good news there, but still, the important thing will be the details. As well as doing things directly, the government can obviously also help the private sector to adjust, and ideally to adjust to a better place. Again, there are a huge number of policies, specific policies in this area, but to give you some examples, on the labour market side, they can do things to make sure, to help people get back in to work. For example, they've already increased the number of work coaches. That's people who sit in job centres and help people find jobs. There is more resource there. But worth saying, it's also going to be a more complicated problem to solve going forward, for various reasons, but including that the people who are out of work are likely to be a bit different now, probably with more education, looking for different types of jobs. And the types of jobs available might be changing. So maybe less consumer-facing jobs and different jobs in the future. So more resource, but a harder problem. The government have also announced a kickstart scheme through which they'll basically pay the wages of 16 to 24-year-olds for 6-month work placements. That's modelled on a previous scheme that was shown to work well. It's obviously aimed at getting young people back into work. And it's a good case to extend that scheme beyond this year, and possibly to consider extending it to other groups of people who might be finding it hard to get into work. And then, of course, as well as thinking about the labour market, the government can ensure that investment incentives are right for the private sector. One example of a lever they can move there is regulations. And that's particularly important if you're thinking about wanting businesses to make big investments. So, for example, if you want businesses to be investing in green technologies, in nuclear power stations, windmills, batteries, whatever it happens to be, we need to make sure that there's certainty over regulations so that businesses are confident in making those large investments. And then one that's close to our heart, obviously the tax system has an effect on investment incentives. At the moment, there are a range of measures that disincentivise investment. The government could remove those and therefore incentivise investment. I've put some examples on the slide. I'll note in passing that these are all tax cuts. They would be kind of good reforms at any time, but good to do now in order to aid the recovery. But they could also be built into a larger package that included, for example, higher rates of tax on business owners in such a way that they would boost the recovery in the short run, but help bolster the public finances in the more medium run. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the kind of challenges and the policies. Let me wrap up by saying that obviously in the short run, the government needs to manage the health crisis and with the withdrawal of lockdown measures and the support measures, and all of that is going to be extremely important for setting up the subsequent recovery. But even once they do that, they're going to be left with some big challenges, including not only undoing the damage caused by the crisis, but also rebuilding in a way that meets the big challenges, including the various increased inequalities and, for example, the move to net zero. So the government should be looking to do a series of things, including supporting demand if necessary in the short run, through to increasing capacity and steering and easing this transition to a new normal. And it has a range of policy measures at its disposal. But hopefully you'll have gleaned from the sort of whistle-stop tour I just gave you that there are no silver bullets here. There is no one policy that's going to magically make the recovery okay. And we don't just need cash. We've actually already spent huge sums on tackling the crisis so far, and there are certainly opportunities to spend more money, but we also need to spend smart. So we need well-designed policies in lots of different areas and joined up policy across different departments to make sure that we get the best recovery we can. And in terms of what it means for the budget, well, there are some measures that I think could be announced or delivered in the short run. So thinking about things like extending the Kickstart scheme, possibly some tax measures, possibly looking at whether we have the capacity to deliver on more teaching resource or more resource for the NHS, although capacity there will be the key constraint. So I think we can look for some measures. But of course, what I've set out is a huge number of very detailed policy areas. The government needs time to get the details right. And I'm sure they'll want some flexibility to respond as the economy evolves. But of course, you also don't want the chance of just making up policies on the fly as we move forward. So I hope what we'll get in the budget is also some kind of strategy, some sense of direction in some of these big key policy areas, and a plan for how we develop the specific policies we need so that we can roll them out and help ensure we have a good recovery when the time is right. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, Jonathan, Isabel, Ben. We've got a load of questions. Thank you very much, and let's dive right in. And there's one question which is clearly the most popular. It's effectively the same question as being asked by Tim Wallace of the Telegraph, Ben Chew of the Independent, and Ed Conway of Sky News. And the question essentially is, well, as Tim puts it very clearly, is there an argument for Sunak to do a Biden and spend big? So Ben, are we in a position where we should be seeing a huge fiscal stimulus as we have done in the US? And indeed, has the fact that Biden wants to do that made it more or less important that we follow the same path?
Absolutely. I think it's, clearly a critical question. On the question of whether it makes it more or less important, economically, if the US is recovering well and is a good source of external demand, that would make it less immediately necessary, or rather it would take some of the burden off UK domestic demand and domestic policy. So in pure economic terms, the US doesn't necessarily make it more essential that the UK adopted the same path, though clearly, the political feedbacks are different if you differentiate those from the economics. On the question of whether there's a broader case for the UK to adopt that kind of approach, indeed, I think there is a case to be made there. I think two important observations. The first is, compared to previous crises, it's clear that the UK is out of monetary policy space, which means that fiscal policy has to take all of the burden, really, for stimulus. And that is clearly different to historic recessions, and I think should change, or rather drive a change in the sense of scale. The second observation goes very much to what Helen was describing about reconfiguration. And that means that not only do you sort of have to support demand potentially, but if you also want people to innovate and generate new opportunities, you have to sort of provide a little bit of excess demand as well, or a bit of excess reward to get people not just to sort of rehire, but actually create new jobs, basically. And I think that's something that Janet Yellen really understands and is driving some of those sorts of quite extravagant policies in the US, and something that was maybe missing in some of Larry Summers' commentary, that sense that you have to generate that bit of excess. That all said, I would definitely echo what Helen said about the need for things to be potentially better targeted than they have been in the US, and, focus as well as on the macro, on the micro, about, how we want the economy to look, and thinking more strategically about complementing some of those aims. And the other point I'd make is very much what you at the IFS have been saying for a long time, which we can go big and we have the capacity to go big for sure, But at the same time, it's important that we do keep a medium-term anchor on the public finances. The UK is not the United States. It doesn't have the same longer-term assurances, and we've been running a dual deficit for many, many years, which makes it particularly important we do offer some sight of credibility in the medium term, even if, you know, we're seeking to be more expansionary immediately.
Can I also jump in? Sorry.
How worried would you be about inflation if we were to really, I mean, the scale of the US expansion is, 10% or more of national income, which is pretty huge. But even if we were to go for something less big than that, how worried would you be about inflation?
I think, yeah, reasonably so. I think, as I was saying in the presentation, it does seem that CPI is going to be pretty robust, at least on a headline level this year. That should be expected to moderate a little as we go into 2022, and some of the cyclical weakness I pointed to starts to feed through more fully. So we don't expect that to be particularly persistent. But I think if you were to do a very large fiscal stimulus, as you said, of a similar order to the United States, it probably would drive a more meaningful sort of trend of higher inflation. And, one important concern in the UK is that household inflation expectations have been relatively high. And if those were pushed even higher, that risks, not just driving the Bank of England to respond relatively quickly, but also risks driving more of those household savings actually sort of into consumption in a more destabilizing inflationary surge. It's inflation expectations that make those savings sort of real, if that makes sense. So I think, I would be concerned about that. I think if the Bank of England communicated very effectively, it could be possible to look past it, potentially at least some of the initial inflationary effects. But as you say, I think if there was a sort of a very, very large stimulus of the order of the Biden package, that could potentially be more difficult, and you risk the Bank of England coming in and offsetting some of those effects.
Helen.
So I just want to jump in and just add that I think it's worth remembering when we compare across countries to sort of think about what we're comparing. So my understanding of the Biden package is that it's a pretty broad package. It's not just about fiscal stimulus and the recovery. It also includes things like vaccination rollout, supporting houses and businesses during the kind of support phase. So we should be comparing that actually to what the government here has already done. So to the 280 billion that Isabel set out. So actually, in some ways, some of what Biden's doing looks to me like doing a Sunak. Some of the things that he's spending on are things we've already spent on. So I think actually we've already spent pretty big on all those recovery measures. And that's kind of what part of what Biden's talking about right now. And of course, on the more forward-looking stuff, on the measures that are about in the recovery, not supporting the economy, but actually trying to boost demand. I think it would be just as important there that we spend smart as opposed to just keeping spending big.
Yeah, and I'd very much echo what Helen and Ben have said there. It's very easy to get hooked up on the scale of some of these things, but in the end, it's spending well that really matters. It's spending in a way which actually gives you a positive return rather than spending, as I think can happen, in ways that don't. But just to stress again some of the figures that Isabel presented at the moment, if we're to believe, and I'm honestly not sure we should believe what the Chancellor said back in November, at the moment we're aiming for cuts in spending in 2022 relative to pre-virus plans. So we're not aiming for an expansion, we're aiming for a contraction in state activity compared with what was expected. Now, I mean, this is a strong word, but I genuinely think that's implausible. The chances that we will come to this time next year and decide that we want to spend less on the health service or less on education or less on local government or less on the justice system than we were planning a year ago seems to me to be extraordinarily unlikely. That probably in the short run will result in some fiscal expansion, because I don't think it's likely that the scale of those increased spending increases rather, and the additional spending, which will no doubt be continuing on some support schemes, and the fact the economy will probably be somewhat lower than it would have been. But all of that together, and I think we will have almost inevitably a significant fiscal expansion, not just this year, next year, but the year after as well, relative to what was previously planned. But to stress again what Ben just said about the need for a fiscal anchor, this isn't something that can simply go on forever, and particularly in the case of the UK, which is not the US and does not have an infinite ability to, well, not the US has an infinite ability, but does not have the same ability to strike off on its own. So I think there is reason to expect, well, we've already seen significant loosening. We'll continue to see some, but we can't take our eye off the long term. So,
if I might add.
Oh yes, Isabel.
Sorry. So at least the OBR in its last forecast did not anticipate a very large, very persistent output gap, such that sort of classically you would say, oh, this is a situation that needs lots of stimulus, particularly. They may change their mind on that, but at least on that basis, I think there are pressures for more spending, as Paul has outlined, but not really from a pure stimulus point of view, at least not on a huge scale.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, this long list of questions. I think I will take the top question again. This one's from Ben Chu of The Independent again. The question is, someone recommended a one-off wealth tax. Will this help stabilise the public finances, or does that require permanent tax increases? I think the very easy answer is, if you want to stabilise the public finances, of course you need permanent tax increases, not one-off ones. I think a one-off wealth tax ought to be thought about entirely in terms of its impact on inequality and any target you might have for reducing wealth inequality. But do you want to add anything to that, Helen?
No, I mean, I agree. I think, in the sense that it would bring in money, obviously, I guess adds to the pot, and that's good. But if we have a permanent deficit, you need permanent solutions to that. So you need more than one-off taxes. I think you're right. I mean, in economic efficiency grounds, one-off wealth taxes can be good because they don't affect decisions about the future, but they have big distributional consequences. So I think the question whether we want one really comes down to a question of fairness. Do we like the implications of a wealth tax, and therefore do we want to do it? I think that should be the debate around wealth taxes.
Absolutely, and of course, don't forget we've got a bunch of wealth taxes at the moment which really don't work very well. And for my money, the first things we should be doing is making inheritance tax work better, make capital gains tax work better, make council tax work better. These are all effectively wealth taxes that we have, which are, to put it politely, suboptimal in their design and in their effect. Got a question from Faisal Islam of the BBC about the shortening maturity of debt, which is occurring via QE. So the issue here, of course, is that because so much of government debt is held by the Bank of England, the effective maturity on that is nil, in the sense that if the Bank of England increases its rates, then the debt interest rates go up immediately, which is not how it normally works with debt, which is sold off into the market. Can we lock low rates in for longer? Ben or Isabel, do you want to have a shot at that?
Well, I think it would certainly, there's a strong case for trying. So at the moment, my understanding is that when the bank does QE, it buys sort of equally across maturity buckets. So if the government sort of tilted its strategy towards issuing more long-dated debt, that would make an impact. I've heard it suggested that if they try to do that, the bank would then also change its strategy of buying up those bonds through QE. So it's not entirely clear what the sort of net effect would be and to what extent it would be possible in the end. I think it's not clear that it would be impossible, and it's fairly clear that it would be desirable. So it's definitely one to look at.
Yeah, I would echo that. fundamentally QE is about shifting around maturities along the yield curve. It isn't, you can't get around that unless you fundamentally change the character of the policy. So it's swapping one interest-bearing asset in the form of government bonds for another in the form of central bank reserves. That said, I think I'd definitely echo what Isabel said in terms of, it's down really to the DMO. If the DMO shifts around where it's issuing, it can definitely seek to counteract some of those effects and, still sort of overwhelm, if you like, the QE effect and lock in lower rates for longer. So it's really down to them and their decision making.
Okay. Let's see what else we've got. Ben, there's a question about the extent to which what's happening at the moment is masking the effects of Brexit. So what would you like to expand a bit on your views about the effects of Brexit? It's extraordinary, really, isn't it? How little we've discussed that or seen that discussed in the press over the last couple of months because of what's happening as a result of COVID. To what extent are these shocks building on one another? To what extent are they quite separate? To what extent will we see more clearly the effects of Brexit towards the end of the year?
Absolutely. We had initially thought that COVID and Brexit would be somewhat additive shocks. So you could think of them somewhat separately because their sectoral distribution was quite different in the sense that Brexit always was, manufacturing and business services were more exposed to Brexit-related effects, and COVID has clearly hit domestic services hardest. What became clear through the latter part of last year was that was wrong. In particular, we've had huge global trade disruption, and that seems to have been particularly severe in the UK, even before the closure of the border at the Channel crossing at the very end of the year. Sort of Felixstowe was severely disrupted. I think Honda in Swindon had to shut down operations because they couldn't get imports in. So there's a global kind of very severe COVID-related trade disruption, and that seemed to be particularly bad in the UK even before we got into some of the kind of last-minute adjustments associated with Brexit. It very much is our sense that COVID and Brexit are compounding one another at the start of this year. We've seen very material reductions in trade flows, and actually the trade data from the fourth quarter was quite disappointing as well. You could sort of say it's masking. I'd just rather say the two effects are compounding each other in the immediate term. And that's, as I say, impacting quite severely. I think as we go over time, we are seeing evidence build that sort of if you think of Brexit as potentially having more persistent effects, those effects are beginning to materialize and they're proving quite severe. So I referenced the ONS business impact of coronavirus survey that sort of splits apart the drivers of disruption for trading firms, and those do indeed point to changes in customs duties and issues related to UK-EU trade specifically. And we've also seen quite significant trade diversions, for example, from the island of Ireland through straight to the European Union, with less trade going via Great Britain, for example. So clearly evidence of some specific Brexit-related effects there. Aside from goods trade, there have also been a handful of stories about the impact on financial services and other kind of business services as well. So there does seem to be a bit of disruption in legal services, for example, though there is some forbearance there. And we've seen huge moves in the location of EU equities trading, which again, you would expect to have some impact on output. So overall, we're definitely seeing early evidence of a pretty marked hit. We're seeing lots of small firms being hit hardest, and we're seeing them choosing not to export. And I think, as I said in the presentation, I think it's reasonable to expect most of the adjustment to Brexit still lies ahead. And it does seem that those costs are likely to accumulate over the course of the year, adding not just to lower trade, but also higher unemployment and weaker investment as well.
Well, yes, thank you. I mean, nothing to be terribly cheerful about there. I mean, it is extraordinary how we are spending so little attention on what is in the end, I would imagine, going to be a much bigger something with much bigger economic consequences for the UK, and still, sadly, panning out very much as projected back before the referendum in 2016 in terms of the additional costs created. Let's move from that very big question to still a big question, a much more specific question. It really has hit the top of the pops in Slido. It's from Ricken Taylor at Westminster City Council, and I think I'll come to you for this one, Helen. What do you see as the future of business rates and possible online sales taxes?
Well, so I hope the future of business rates will be a reformed business rate system. So we knew that even before anyone knew what COVID was, the business rate system had problems. And it's effectively because it's a combination of kind of the best tax and the worst tax. So partly it's taxing land values, and that's kind of a good thing to tax because it doesn't distort behaviour. But partly the way it's designed in such a way that it distorts businesses' decisions over their investments. So really what we should be doing is reforming business rates to effectively move to a land value tax for non-residential properties, and therefore sort of removing the distortionary element of it. So that's what I hope will happen, and hopefully the fact that we changed the system at the moment, so hopefully we'll move in that direction. On this thing about online sales taxes, I think there's a bit of a kind of a common myth that business rates were the thing that was killing the high street even before COVID, and that's just not true. Especially when you think that a lot of business rates will be passed on to the landowners. They'll be the ones that ultimately bear the burden of the business rates, not necessarily the people who are occupying the building. So it's not necessarily the occupiers who are paying the tax. So we shouldn't be thinking of as online sales tax as something that's going to somehow offset the effect of business rates. I think some people talk about online sales taxes in the kind of COVID context in order to tax those businesses who are able to sell things during COVID. We could think about windfall taxes. Probably just a windfall increase in corporation tax would be much more straightforward. And longer run, if we want to do tax some of the businesses like Amazon's, it's not really about online sales, it's about how you tax the profits of Amazon. That really gets into much bigger issues about the international corporation tax system. So punchline, I think we should reform business rates, but not try to be offsetting it with a new online sales tax.
Thank you. There's a couple of big questions here about investment policy, essentially. Was one question saying, is it realistic to expect us to achieve ambitious policy goals, net zero levelling up and so on, without increasing debt levels? And another saying that despite World War II debt, the NHS, the welfare state, were created in the late 1940s. Should we not now be investing for the future? Let me start by just making two observations about those questions. I mean, the first is that certainly harking back to World War II, don't forget that in that period when there was that investment for the future, the constraints on household consumption were really very extreme. I mean, this was not a set of policies that were put in place without pain at the time they were put in place. And that's not to say they were the wrong things to do, but don't forget that they were not funded as part of a spending spree, as it were, on top of the debt that was there. They were funded with, or at least they were accompanied by very hair-shirt economic policies that I think would be very hard and probably not appropriate to replicate at the moment. Second thing I'd say about investment for the future is that yes, of course, there's a strong case for this. That actually, on current plans, government investment is going to be rising to its highest levels, certainly since the era of privatization in the beginning of the 1980s. And to repeat the point from the first question, terribly important that is well and sensibly invested, as well as thinking about the scale. And if you're thinking about net zero, for example, really important to think about the private sector here. As a member of the Climate Change Committee, I think our view is that the large majority of the investment required to achieve net zero should and will happen through the private sector, as it has indeed so far. All of the very large investments in green energy, for example, have happened via the private sector. And the last thing I would say in answer to this is, in a sense, there is an economic case, of course, for additional investment at the moment, to the extent that the economy is not operating at full tilt, and the public investment can help it get there. But don't forget that we're poorer than we were, and poorer than we thought we were going to be. And that actually makes things more difficult, not less difficult. I mean, that is the, that is the sort of basic, simple fact here. If we're poorer than we were, then doing more stuff is more difficult, not less difficult. Not to say that it's the wrong thing to do, and in the short run, maybe it's more appropriate to do it, but over the longer run, it makes things more difficult. Do any of my fellow panelists want to respond to that one?
I guess I agree with that. So I guess I'd quickly sort of highlight the obvious that the best way for us to get out of this big debt pile is to grow. And if the more the economy grows and the bigger the economy gets again, the easier we'll find it to service that debt pile. So I think the government should be seeing the investment, however big we're going to make it, as an opportunity to try to get growth up. And as Paul said, be really thinking about how the government can do the things that are going to crowd in private sector investment. So what are the scientific investments that need to be made in areas where the private sector won't take on the risk, but the government could take on the risk? Or what where does the government need to make sure that policy frameworks are there, that regulations are certain, that firms know the policy environment they're facing, so they can have the confidence to make those big investments. So I think it's not just about money and making opportunity, but being smart about how you spend it and making sure that all of the policies are pushed in the same direction, so that regulations and tax policies and planning, all that kind of stuff, are all giving the same incentives for firms to have the confidence to go and make the big investments that might actually boost growth and make it easier for us to service that big pile of debt.
Let me move on now. I think this is a question probably aimed at Ben. I've seen it zip up the popularity stakes a moment ago from Faisal again at the BBC. Do you have a sense of the proportion of the 125 billion in household savings that will be consumed as opposed to spent on housing? I'll ask you that first, Ben.
So on the housing side, it's not as precise as it might be, but one of the ways we've been looking at this is by comparing the overall value of housing transactions versus new mortgage lending. And what we find is there is about 75 billion in excess sort of housing market transactions, which are in excess of the usual correlation you'd see between those two. So that could be an indication of how the scale of these deposits that have flown into the UK housing market in a sort of reversal of what we saw in the early noughties. So we had housing de-equitisation then, we have housing re-equitisation now. With respect to the scale that might still be spent, I think the estimates the Bank of England put out in February were actually pretty reasonable, about in the order of around about 5% over the next 3 years. So it's definitely not a zero. It's a reasonable boost. It's just not the kind of single solution to the recovery that it seems some have suggested it might be.
No, in a sense, I think the question was not implying that it would be. I think it was more of a concern that it might simply fuel the housing market. We're getting towards the end. I mean, there's a number of questions here about what tax rises we should be looking at in the medium run. I mean, if we are to be looking at 30, 40, 50, 60 billion of tax increases, where should we go looking, Helen?
So I think, well, the first thing you can do is think about big taxes. If you want to get big sums easily, then we get most of our revenue from our income tax, NICs and VAT, our big three taxes. So it's going to be difficult to get really big sums if you tie your hands and do nothing there. To give you a sense of scale, if you put an extra percentage point on each rate of income tax, you get about 6 billion. Another percentage point on the rate of VAT, you get about 6 billion. So you could easily do some sort of relatively small changes there that got some relatively big sums. But I think, so they should be on the cards to be considered. But I think actually the government should really look at the bits of the tax system that are either currently very unfair or currently broken, and try to reform those in a way that would also raise some revenue. So just to list a few examples, you've already mentioned things like inheritance tax, capital gains tax. There are big tax breaks within capital gains tax that we should be looking to remove. More broadly, we tax business owners, so the self-employed and company managers, at lower rates than employees. We've talked about a lot at IFS. There are good reasons to remove those differences, but also make reforms in the tax base through investment incentives, so we don't discourage investment. So that could be really part of a big broad package that, as I mentioned in the talk, in the short run helped boost investment, in the longer run had higher tax rates that helped raise revenues. And as we've mentioned business rates and council tax. Council tax is horribly out of date, regressive. We should be revaluing and reforming council tax. So I think really there's lots of options to get revenue, but we should reform our system, because badly designed taxes basically mean that taxes are more damaging than they otherwise would be. And of course that matters at all points in time. But now when we think the economy is doing badly, we need to make the damage as low as possible. So we should reform taxes. Almost there's something that needs reform. You could pick whatever you like, but pick some big areas of tax, start reforming them, and then raise those reforms taxes rather than just raise the poorly designed ones we've got now.
I think one of the more surprising things I discovered yesterday, I think a few days after it was announced, is that the Chancellor has, or the government has, slipped out, as it were, the announcement that personal tax allowance will rise a little bit in March, only £70 from 12,500 to 12,570. But if you'd asked me to bet on how taxes might be increased over the next little while, I'd have thought some freezing of those allowances might have been an easy political win, particularly given the very big increases we've seen in those allowances over recent years. But as Helen says, if we're really looking at big amounts of money, then it is hard to see how we do that without looking at the big taxes. And whilst there are lots of things one might want to do with wealth taxes and fixing environmental taxes and so on, in the end, if we're looking at a couple of percent of national income or more, it's pretty hard to see how you get that without taxing incomes or spending, because that's where, both in this country and right across the world, where the very large majority of tax comes from. Room for, I think, one very final question, and it's a big one. It comes from Roman Halskachach, it's certainly wrong, from Grove Consulting. Are there any limits to what government can borrow? Ben or Isabel, would you like to take that? Are there any limits?
Yes. I'm sure the IFS will be pleased to hear me say that. I think one of the interesting things that's clearly become manifest through this crisis is, fiscal policy and monetary policy, the traditional dichotomy that we've got used to over recent decades, is increasingly, becoming more closely aligned, in the sense that with monetary policy, and rates increasingly constrained, central banks are increasingly depending on the fiscal authorities to take the space they're being given by monetary policy to sort of go and stimulate the economy and provide that function. I think, when you're then thinking about the limits, clearly inflation comes front and center, because as long as central banks are doing what they should be, which is still ultimately trying to ensure price stability, that's the thing that's going to see the central bank increase rates, tighten borrowing conditions for the government, and constrain fiscal policy. So inflation is now an important kind of, I think, factor in many countries in what fiscal policy can do and what.
Oh dear, we seem to have lost Ben rather mid-flow there. I don't think it's just me who's lost him, because I can see everybody else. Well, we're pretty much at the end there. Isabel, have you got a couple of words to say on whether there are limits? I think the answer
but if it,
yes.
Oh, he's back.
Sorry,
Ben, we lost you in the middle there.
I was just saying the current account deficit is also a big one, in the sense that you need to ensure you're credible to international investors if you're going to carry on borrowing, and that applies clearly for fiscal policy always. but it's more if you know your key constraint is really sort of central bank policy and the ability to provide that liquidity. It's really on the external side that you're going to find a really much harsher constraint. And in that sense, the UK, I think, has lived with dual deficits for a long time. The key risk we have to avoid is a triple deficit, one where that dual deficit is joined with doubts about our institutional credibility. And that requires both the Bank of England and the fiscal authority to really work hard to make sure we're being proactive in kind of giving people that sort of confidence. Sorry, Isabel. Yes.
No, I would sign all of that.
Great. Well, we're bang on 11:30, and I strongly endorse what Ben just said there about the risk associated with us losing any credibility in our institutions and policies and politics and governance, which I think is something that both government and opposition need to be very, very careful about under current circumstances. But thank you so much to everyone who has listened to these presentations and put in questions. Thank you to my colleagues, to Jonathan, to Isabel, and to Helen, and also particularly to Ben from Citi. We've only got a couple of weeks now to wait and find out what the Chancellor will actually do, whether this will be a big budget or whether it will be another in the set of relatively small budgets that we've seen in recent years, and whether indeed he'll come back for another 13 big fiscal events between this and the next budget. But thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll see you at our presentation on March the 4th, when we will be unpicking what has actually been announced. Thank you very much indeed.